I would like to introduce Mark Mendiza, our Vice President.
Hello, everyone. I feel so privileged to introduce our esteemed speaker this morning or this evening, depending on where you are in the world. The Roundtable has been searching for the truth about the Shakespeare canon for about 40 years, almost 40, 39. We've had audience members from all over the world, of course, even El Salvador, which I think is a new one for us. Welcome, Absul. From all over the world, including the Nordic realm. But I think Geir Uthaug is the first speaker we've had from Norway. And so we're just very lucky to have him. This is an important date for all of us because the fact that his book has been written and he's found an excellent translator in himself. And it's going to be published in English very, very soon. And that's a huge thing for all of us. And also, we're lucky because he's not only an insightful writer about authorship, he's an insightful writer on the entire romantic universe, which is the name of just one of his books. He is also a critic, a broadcaster, a translator of poetry, and a poet in his own right. His nonfiction works include a monograph on William Blake, The Cosmic Forge, and the book on romanticism called The Romantic Universe. His verse translations of English poetry include Byron's Don Juan, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Keats' Endymion, Blake's Milton, and Songs of Innocence and Experience. The name Geir is a Norse name meaning spear, which seemed appropriate to us all. Today, Geir's topic is neither Oxford nor Looney, but the political scene in the England of Elizabeth I. So please, everyone, please welcome our honored guest, Geir Uthaug.
I'm honored to be here, and I'm very happy that you want to have me as a speaker. Well, I can show you the book, of course. This is the Norwegian version of it, where I'm quite pleased with the image, the battle over Shakespeare's identity. Well, the topic, as I said in my current talk, is the political scene in Elizabeth's England, with special attention to the often harsh methods used in order to exercise full control. This has a heavy impact on the understanding of Shakespeare's plays and the situation of dramatists at the time in general. Questions have been asked. Why was it necessary for the dramatist to use a pseudonym, if that indeed was the case? Well, the answer is obvious. It was extremely dangerous to write a play, or a poem, or a tract, or an essay, or anything at all. The authorities were constantly on the lookout for subversive material which could not be tolerated. We normally think of England as a democratic country, which it has been for a long time. But any idea of democracy in a modern sense must be put aside when we are dealing with Elizabethan times. It was a harsh society with strict laws and brutal punishment. The freedom of the press was championed in the 18th century, but that was when this became a feature of British culture. But in Elizabethan times, nothing like that existed yet. Every play was scrutinized by the office of the Lord Chamberlain through the agency of the Master of the Revels. Plays which did not satisfy the authorities or suspected of being subversive in any way were shut down immediately. Actors and people connected with the theatre risked punishment for performing in such plays. This was brought to light when the tragedy of King Richard II was performed in London in a number of venues on the eve of the Essex Rebellion in 1601. Members of the company were hauled before officials and interrogations were conducted concerning the subversive nature of the play, which was seen as supporting the rebellion. It is, of course, this play which has the famous scene where the king is decrowned in front of the court and parliament. He actually takes the crown off his own head quite opposite to Napoleon, who, as we know, put the crown on his own head, crowning himself emperor. The odd thing about this scene is, of course, that the supposed author of the play, William Shakespeare, or Shakspeare, who belonged to the Lord Chamberlain's men, was never brought in for questioning. When it came to the written word or printed matter, every book which was published through normal channels had to be approved by the stationer's office, a body supervised by no less a personage than the Archbishop of Canterbury. When approved, it was entered in the stationer's register, which is the most historically reliable source we have for the Shakespeare plays and other written material. Why was this scrutiny of plays and books deemed necessary? Well, I just mentioned the Essex Rebellion, led by Robert Devereux, this gentleman, the Earl of Essex, who tried to topple the government and possibly abduct the Queen for political ends. Well, England herself was very threatened in the 16th century. Queen Elizabeth was high on the list, in fact, the first on the Pope's list of excommunicated. The Pope could not forgive that Elizabeth, when she became queen in 1556, put aside her half-sister Mary's Catholic legacy to re-establish Protestantism as the religion of England. England was very much an island, and an isolated island at that. Her formidable adversaries, France, Spain, and Italy, the Catholic powers, constituted a threat, and this threat was substantiated by innumerable plots or would-be plots aimed at deposing or assassinating the Queen and re-establishing a Catholic government. The religious question was linked to a political issue. Ever since Henry VIII's break with Rome, it had been a political issue. Protestantism was seen as English. Catholicism, on the other hand, was seen as foreign. When Mary Tudor reigned, the court of St. James was filled with Spanish dignitaries and envoys. When Elizabeth took over, many of these courtiers were obliged to return to their native land, Spain. Europe was rent with the great divide that the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had caused. Well, the 16th century was otherwise characterized by Spain's overseas expansion. The country was at its peak of power under the leadership of Philip II of Habsburg. Not only was Philip the leader of the world's superpower when Elizabeth became queen, ruling a kingdom that stretched across the Atlantic to the Americas, he was also an ardent Catholic. The Pope in Rome was the supreme head of all Catholics, but Philip was his henchman, the defender and practitioner of what he considered to be the only true Christian faith. Philip had sent Spanish troops commanded by the Duke of Alba, Ferdinand Alvarez de Toledo, to the Netherlands to force the rebellious Dutch Protestants into submission. The English knew that on Philip's command, Alba could at any time lead an army across the Channel, so they spent expeditionary forces to support the Protestants in the Netherlands. France, too, was a power to reckon with. The country was ruled by Catholics, but nonetheless torn by civil and religious strife. It came to a head in August 1572, during the St. Bartholomew Day, when Paris exploded in scenes of violence and carnage. Thousands of French Protestants or Huguenots, men, women, and even children, were massacred by order of the Duke of Guise. One appalled witness to the bloodshed was the English ambassador, Francis Walsingham, who never forgot the lesson and swore that this would never happen in England. The reign of Elizabeth is reckoned as a golden age for England. Much of the glory goes to the Queen herself, who was a leader of distinction and knew how to choose and guide her own advisers, among whom William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, deserves a special mention. On the Queen's behalf, he steered the ship of state through every gale for almost 40 years. As a politician, he is considered to be a real politician. He was no fanatic, but neither was he sentimental, and he ordered actions to be taken which appalls us today. Burleigh saw it as his duty to safeguard the life of the Queen, and his methods could be brutal. The time of Elizabeth is unique. There can be no question about that. But it is also one of the epochs most shrouded in myth in the history of England, perhaps only surpassed by the Arthur legends. With Cecil's aid and Walsingham's help, she secured the peace both at home and abroad. The victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 put Spain out of play and made England an overseas power, and began the building of the British Empire. Today, historians often point to the uncertainty of the times and how vulnerable the Queen must have felt in regard to her own safety, which was threatened from many quarters, and the destiny of the country, which by no means was determined at her accession. So to underline the Queen's position and sovereignty, Parliament in 1559 passed two acts, the Acts of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The former stated that not only was the Queen head of state, but also head of the Church, which deposed the Pope in Rome as head of the Church of England. The other law established that the Church of England should use the Book of Common Prayer, the Protestant prayer book. So again, the breach with Rome had happened. In 1570, Pius V responded by excommunicating Elizabeth. She was banned from the church and the body of Christ, as the papal ban put it. The Pope allowed every Catholic to disregard the vows to the Queen of England. She was now outside the church protection, and anyone was free to rid Christianity of a heretic who was also a bastard and an usurper. In the eyes of the Pope, Elizabeth was illegitimate, and she was the fruit of the illegal union of King Henry VIII by his lady-in-waiting Anne Boleyn. So Parliament remonstrated by a new law of 1571, and this was strengthened by an even sterner law of 1585, which concerned the Queen's safety. It was called the Law of the Queen's Surety. Anyone who either on writing or orally dared to suggest that the Queen was not legitimate or had the right to the English throne was guilty of treason. To introduce measures from Rome in England or spread Catholic pamphlets was also paramount to treason. When Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, a man who had nailed the decree to the church door of Old St. Paul's was immediately arrested and hanged as a traitor. Many Catholics felt offended that a woman could proclaim herself head of the English church. Elizabeth ought to be removed and replaced by someone more worthy. There was only one person to fit the bill as they saw it, Mary Stuart. She was a descendant of Henry VII's Tudor and was entitled to inherit the English throne. She was a woman too, that is so, but she had the right faith. As Elizabeth's devoted civil servant, Walsingham, the very same who had witnessed the massacres in Paris, was to build an unprecedented spy network. It reached from Scotland to Prague, from London to Rome and Madrid. In the course of 20 years, he was the spy master. The number of informants he made use of and conspirators he had brought to trial was formidable. The trail often leads to Catholic princes, to the Duke of Guise, Philip of Spain, and the Pope in Rome. Well, in the years 1572 to 1587, England's home affairs mostly entails a host of these conspiracies and plans for a coup, which were aimed at deposing Elizabeth and placing Mary on the throne. It involved spies at home and abroad, foreign ambassadors, letters which were intercepted, code breakers who interpreted messages which were passed on to non-suspecting recipients, men who came to secret meetings, spies who followed them and listened outside doors. It involved heavy use of double agents and some who did not know which side they worked for, a world foreshadowing John le Carré, but what begins as a thriller ends like a horror movie. Arrests and harsh interrogations, torture on the dreaded bench in the Tower of London, which could make healthy men cripples, confessions under threats, trials without counsels of defense, and protracted, barbaric, horrific executions where the culprits were hanged, drawn, and quartered. All the same, there were conspirators who were willing to be assassins. In Rome and Reims, there were seminaries organized especially for English Catholic emigrants, who in addition to ordinary monk rituals and rituals of penance and prayer, also hatched plans of how to kill the Queen, something the Pope had more or less condoned. When the literary man, Anthony Munday, later became secretary to the Earl of Oxford, he joined such a priest seminary in Rome and reported how hatred of the Queen was force for many who were later smuggled into England. Here they lived a wandering existence until caught, imprisoned, and not unfrequently executed. The Church of Rome honored them by proclaiming them martyrs. One such was the Jesuit and scholar Edmund Campion, who was arrested and at his trial in 1581 was denied pen and ink for his own defense, which Shakespeare may refer to in Twelfth Night when Malvolio in his cell is denied pen and ink. In 1569, the rebel earls Westmoreland and Northumberland collected an army in northern England and marched on Elizabeth. The goal was to free Mary Stuart, who was under arrest, and depose the Queen. The rebellion was put down, and more than 800 rebels hanged on the spot without trial. 2 years later, in 1571, the Pope tried by an Italian merchant in London, Signor Ridolfi, to send money to support a conspiracy whose aim was to have the Duke of Norfolk marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and that meant deposing Elizabeth. The Duke of Norfolk was Elizabeth's cousin, so this was regarded as a direct attack on the security of the state from one of the people close to the Queen. The Duke was brought to trial in Westminster Hall and would pay with his life. Parliament said that Mary was just as guilty as he was and ought to be executed as a conspirator, but the Queen opposed this most firmly. She refused to be the cause in the death of an anointed queen. For if that could happen to Mary, who said it could not happen to Elizabeth? Mary had sought sanctuary with her cousin in 1567, when the Scots deposed her after a series of dramatic events, culminating in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, which was performed by Mary's new lover, the Scotch nobleman Bothwell. Even though Mary was officially Elizabeth's guest, it soon became apparent that she represented a security threat. She was a prisoner for 19 years and was moved from one castle to the other, while it was debated what to do with her. To send her back to Scotland was no solution. To let her go to France was not a good idea either. Mary, who was the daughter of Marie Guise, had had her upbringing in France. Her first husband was the French Dauphin, who later became King François II. Her close relative, the Duke of Guise, planned in 1584 to sail over the Channel with an army of 15,000 men. In England, he was assisted by a young gentleman, Francis Throckmorton, who supplied the Duke with maps of landing places and contacts. Before the Duke could implement his plans, Throckmorton had been reported and arrested. He confessed and had to suffer the horrific death of a traitor. The plot, which did in the end finish Mary, happened in 1586. It has been named after Anthony Babington, a young romantically inclined gentleman with Catholic sympathies. Babington dreamt of liberating her and catch Elizabeth in an ambush. To this end, he would be assisted by more like-minded Catholic gentlemen. The conspirators were careless and used to meet at an inn in London to discuss plans, but Walsingham had spies everywhere. Mary, who was staying at an estate in Staffordshire, had her contact in Paris, and they passed messages to each other by means of couriers. What none of them knew was that the couriers worked for Walsingham. Even though the letters between Babington and Mary were in code, the minister got his code breakers to decipher the codes so that he knew, even before the letter was passed on. Babington was too impulsive or gullible. His letters were too honest, but it was the Scottish Queen's answer to the young man which was crucial. Mary later claimed that she had not written the fatal letter, and no one could prove that she had. All the same, the evidence was too strong and held up in court. Babington and his gentlemen were hanged and disemboweled in front of spectators near St. Giles in London, and their severed heads put on spikes. As a result of Burghley's clever manipulation, and in spite of Elizabeth's protest, Mary was beheaded in the presence of the lords in the Great Hall at Fotheringay Castle. Elizabeth let her chair stand empty. The news of Mary's execution caused widespread protests all over Europe. The new Pope, Sixtus V, had renewed the papal decree of excommunication of Elizabeth in 1585. Philip, who had for a long time tried to withhold his intentions behind a mask of diplomacy, lost patience. Encouraged by the Pope and the leader of the emigrant seminaries, he collected in 1588 his invincible armada, comprised of 200 big warships, and sailed from Portugal to England to admonish the people there and bring the country back to the Mother Church. It was a great trial of strength between David and Goliath. It went as in the biblical story. The giant was defeated in the English Channel by a combination of English seamanship, light vessels, fire ships, and ferocious weather. People in England praised the Queen and her brave seamen, headed by John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, who had rescued them from disaster. The gales that destroyed the remnants of the Spanish fleet were regarded as God's punishment on England's enemies. Francis Walsingham, the Queen's watchdog, knew that in order to avoid conspiracies and assassinations and prevent the country from falling into enemy hands, vigilance was of vital importance. On one of the portraits of the Queen, she wears a dress imprinted with countless eyes and ears. None who had ill intentions should feel safe. Concerning England's defenders, as Walsingham put it, there is less danger in fearing too much than too little. So how could these events influence Shakespeare and his doings? At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the censorship exercised by the Lord Chamberlain and the Stationer's Office. Interestingly, this is referred to by the bard himself, who in Sonnet 66 speaks of art tongue-tied by authority. The sonnet goes like this: tired with all these, for restful death I cry, as to behold desert a beggar born, and needy nothing trimmed in jollity, and purest faith unhappily forsworn, and guided honor shamefully misplaced, and maiden virtue rudely strumpeted, and tight perfection wrongfully disgraced, and strength by limping sway disabled, and art made tongue-tied by authority, and folly doctor-like controlling skill add simple truth miscalled simplicity, and captive good attending captain ill. Tired with all these, from these would I be gone, save that to die I leave my love alone. It is a cry of distress on behalf of himself and humankind, like portions of King Lear. Much may be said of the sonnets, but we shall leave them here to return to the main topic, the vulnerability of the Queen and the many attempts on her life and the task of protecting her. Sometimes the authority simply went too far. An example of this is when a writer named Stubbs dared to criticize the Queen's proposed marriage to a foreign prince, the French Dauphin, Duke Alençon. He had not taken the precaution to find himself a suitable pseudonym or publish his views anonymously. It was easy to track him and to set an example to anyone who would dare to be so outspoken in their criticism of the sovereign. His right hand, by which he had formulated the offensive lines, was chopped off by the executioner's assistant. The Queen, in the end, never married Alençon, who died on the campaign in the Netherlands while yet a young man. Some say Alençon was the Queen's real love, but as we know, she decided to marry England instead and became the famous Virgin Queen. A sound advice to keep your hand, or in some cases your head, was to publish either anonymously or using a pseudonym, which was not easy to guess. A certain Martin Marprelate, who issued pamphlets aimed at attacking the bishops, was wanted for his subversive activities. His true identity was never discovered, but his writings were burned and his presses destroyed. He was ridiculed by another pseudonymous writer, calling himself Pasquale Cavaliero, clearly an aristocrat, and very much opposed to the Puritans, who, by the way, was never discovered either. So in order to be on the safe side, it was a good precaution to publish under a nom de plume. So we find that an astonishing number of works was published either with a pseudonym or without any name at all. Some of these were publications not approved by the stationers, a most risky business, but there are even plays noted in the stationer's register with no name, only the name of the official who entered the play. And this goes for all the plays which today are credited Shakespeare before 1597, when these plays began to appear with the author's name on the title page. In 45% of the cases, the name was spelled in two names divided by a hyphen, as we see here, Shakespeare. Many scholars think it must be a pseudonym, since nobody wrote their names like that unless for satirical purposes. At the end of Elizabeth's reign, 80% of all plays were anonymous, a number which did not dwindle to 50% until well into the 17th century. Virginia Woolf, who thought it not unreasonable that there were more women engaged in playwriting and other activities dealing with the playhouses, wondered why women are so conspicuously absent. She wrote, "I thought, looking at the shelf where there are no plays by women, her world would have gone unsigned." And for some who speculate that there might have been a woman's hand behind Shakespeare's work, is it thinkable that a woman could have used Shakespeare as her pseudonym, or at least contributed to such a project? In that case, she did have a reason to keep her identity hidden. I have in this talk avoided to take up the gauntlet for any one particular candidate, nor have I said much about the quest for the real author, or, as I put it in my book, The Battle over Shakespeare's Identity, which is a fascinating story in itself, the clash between the disciplined ranks of mainstream scholars and those who dare to question their authority, and above all the authority of the legend, which has been upheld throughout the centuries by learned and unlearned alike. It is rather like the famous gigantic image of the Wizard of Oz, projected through a magic lantern operated by a rather feeble individual or replica, using his mechanism for the purpose of mesmerizing the crowd. How long will it go on? It is hard to say, even though, to my mind, groundbreaking research is being done, which must surely shatter the magic bauble. This is not likely to happen soon. Even today, after centuries of debates and evidence, one evidently prefers to create and believe in new myths, like the story of the boy Hamnet, which is mistaken for the truth, or the endless speculation about a person who is indeed an enigma, and likely to remain so, that is preferred to the historic truth. Nonetheless, the quest must go on. The work of the skeptics is not valueless. At least it helps to reveal a historic period which is fascinating and inspiring for its enigmas and its challenges. Shakespeare became an icon and a national legend. This is partly the reason why we have an authorship problem. For while Shakespeare the icon was celebrated, the footprints of Shakespeare the man vanished. It became paramount to trace him, and there is hardly an individual in history who has been exposed to such an intense, prolonged, and systematic scrutiny as William Shakespeare. Through generations, historians, linguists, amateurs, antiquaries, and literary sleuths have tried to find his lair and dug up all they have been able to lay their hands on, but the result has not been overtly impressive. Vast resources, even whole lives, have been used in order to discover more about the man behind the myth. But even as one imagines oneself to be on the right track, the trail has a tendency to disappear into a rough and uncertain terrain. What one is left with is guesswork. Concerning the so-called lost years, E.K. Chambers, who is respected in all camps, has put it wisely. It is no use guessing. After all careful scrutiny of clues and all the patient balancing of possibilities, the last word for a self-respecting scholarship can only be that of nescience. And this remark concludes my presentation. The rest is, as some will say, scholarship.
Everyone, you can put your questions in the chat. Yeah, thank you. Excellent presentation. How many levels of authority were there in Elizabethan times designed to censor art?
Well, that's a very tricky question. I mentioned the stationers and the master of the revels and the Lord Chamberlain, but I'm sure there also were other levels. But perhaps some of the viewers knows more about this.
I missed the opening. When will the English language version of your book be available?
Well, that's easier to answer. Well, it will take some time because, you know, it's a special process. I may have to abbreviate it a bit, for instance, and things like that. So it will, I'm not quite sure, but maybe this year or maybe beginning of next year. That's all I can say.
Was there opposition to theater itself at the time?
Yes, of course, there was opposition, especially from the Puritans, because they had started now to emerge as a social group and as a political group. And sometimes the authorities in the city, for instance, and in parts of London were controlled by Puritan elements. That is why some of the theatre people preferred to live outside the walls of London itself. For instance, even Edward de Vere, he had his lair outside Bishopsgate, near the theatre, and there were others, of course. And in that area, there were a lot of people connected with the theatre. So when they stayed there, they were not subjected to Puritan sort of rules and regulations, because Puritans even closed the theatres because they thought it was, you know, the place were rude or lewd or, you know.
Here's a question. Does scholarship confirm that one author dominated the works of Shakespeare?
Modern scholarship, if that confirms. All right. Well, of course, there are, as we know, many schools here with special candidates, and they have reasons for believing that this or that candidate is the right one. Personally, although I am, you might say, an Oxfordian, I have a special interest in Edward de Vere, and because he's a very interesting personality. And yet, I think that there must have been more than one person. I think it must have been a group, not necessarily group theory, but there were people, I think, who collaborated. And maybe one of the places I've sort of sketched this in the book as a suggestion that one of the places where this happened could have been Fisher's Folly, because Oxford had returned from Italy. He had seen how Italian painters used various others to collaborate in their work, like Titian, for instance. And he had seen that, and he got the idea that we can do the same. And some of his secretaries, of course, are people who have written and who are considered to be Shakespeare's sources. I mean, and these people, of course, they could have come together and collaborated and given each other ideas. I mean, just think of the Walt Disney Studios, where one artist came up with the idea. What about giving this and that character this and that, something to say in that film and so forth. And Walt Disney himself said, yeah, that's a good idea. So they put it in, for instance, in Snow White. Well, this has happened many times in literary history. And I think that it might have been a sort of scenario for a part of this. Not the sonnets, of course. That is a very personal and very, very personal kind of project. Mm.
Do you think there is any possibility that Shakespeare could have been Catholic? And if not, why not?
Many people have had the idea that he was perhaps Catholic. For instance, Loney himself, he thought when he started just thinking about the characteristics of the author, he thought that Catholicism was perhaps one of the characteristics. You can't really say that the works of Shakespeare are very religious works. You can't really say that. It touches on religion, of course, but mostly he uses classical gods of the ancient world and so forth in many of the plays. And when he talks about religion, it's mostly the established church, bishops, priests, and so forth.
You had mentioned that hyphenating Shakespeare's name implied satire. Could you explore that a bit?
That was used by Ben Jonson, for instance, in his satires. Many of his characters have these double names.
Was there evidence and discussions in your country that led you to the authorship question?
No, actually, I was led to the authorship question by reading some books, and I was also prompted by some friends who were interested in this. And I started to read, for instance, John Michell's book. I had myself been interested in Shakespeare. I had even translated Shakespeare, Richard II. But I wasn't really interested in his life story because it was just a sort of story to me. But when I read this book, then I said, oh, there's more to it than this. And then I started to be really interested, and it just grew on from there, I would say.
And what is your favorite Shakespeare play and why?
Well, of course, I have a very special relationship, I might say, with Richard II because I worked on that for 2 or 3 years. It was a BBC production with Derek Jacobi as Richard, and it made a great impression. And I just went home and started on the translation without contacting any theater or anything. Absolutely something you're not supposed to do, but anyway, I did.
Was the use of a pseudonym sufficient to protect a seditious writing?
It was better, I suppose, to be absolutely anonymous than to have a pseudonym, because a pseudonym could be found out.
After 1588 Armada victory, you say the British Empire begins. Was the first act to establish Jamestown?
Jamestown, of course, was established quite early, wasn't it? It's a start in the sense that that was the first period of what became the empire. It wasn't sort of an act establishing the empire. It was a gradual. That was, of course, a gradual process.
Thank you so much, Geir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciated that. Thank you.